Well, hi, everybody, and welcome to the Cultural Studies podcast. My name is Toby Miller, and my guest today is
Gerry Hanlon. I'm or Gerard Hanlon, which I'm in London. The English can never quite pronounce the Ger, or Gerard Hanlon, as I'm kind of known officially, which is interesting because in Ireland, Gerard is a sort of working class name,
yeah,
and Gerald is quite posh in Ireland,
yes, yes.
and it's the reverse here in England. So the English always call me Gerald. I guess I think I must be posh in England. Which comes as news to me.
And that's also interesting because thinking of sectarian matters in Glasgow, historically, as you know, and as some listeners will know, Glasgow Celtic was more or less the Catholic team with a greater or lesser connection to Ireland. And Glasgow Rangers was more or less the Protestant team. And they're known as the Gers.
They are known as the Gers, yeah. So there's another twist in the name. But I used to have some fun and mild embarrassment, I guess, when you'd be talking to people, they'd ask you your name. Established professors, when I first arrived here in the UK, would garble and struggle, and in the end, I'd go, "Just call me Gerry. It's easier."
Now, Prof, I'll call you Prof.
Okay.
Which when you first arrived probably wasn't a term that was available to use, but
It was not.
it's been available for quite some time, Prof. No, Gerry, we've been friends for 15 years and I very much cherish our friendship. I hadn't realized it was that long ago that we met, but
Yeah, it's a long old time.
it is a long time. And in that time and before that period, you've done an enormous amount of work, which has deeply influenced me and many others. But before we get onto that, before we get onto the sort of back, as they say in baseball, into the prehistoric time of the Ger, I wanted to ask you about what's on your mind right now, right here, because at the moment we're speaking in the beginning of March 2025. It's almost impossible for many of us not to talk about one particular topic.
Yeah.
I'm not trying to press you into discussing that, but let me ask you, is that on your mind?
It very much is, because it's been on my mind in a roundabout way for about 2 years. Not initially, maybe more actually, maybe 5 years. Not initially connected to the Ukraine and Russia, but obviously at the moment geopolitics is all the rage, and both Trump before Biden and then Biden and now Trump again have sort of centralized, in one sense, state kind of industrial policy, as well as tariffs and all that kind of stuff, as they, with fear of the rise of China, particularly as an economic, but also as a military power. And my work in the last 3 or 4 years has really taken a military turn. As you know, my work has always been about how we organize work. I guess through Thorstein Veblen, strangely, I got interested in standardization and interchangeability and things like that, so that when you travel the globe, your plug fits into the socket, generally speaking, or you bring an adapter and it works for you. But if you're in America, every plug will fit into every kind of socket kind of thing equally here in the UK, and that's interchangeability, and standardization, and it starts in the military. So I'm in a business school, for those people who don't know of me, which are many and many of you. But when you look at the work organization as a form through the lens of the business school, which is the biggest producer of graduates in the UK, it always starts with management. And it starts with the divorce, in one sense, of the public and the private. The corporation and the entrepreneur is kind of lauded as this great innovator. And actually, when you go back to track it, many of the innovations start in the military. Both from, if you think of the military just as an army, as a concept, it's hierarchical, it's very tightly commanded. Every soldier, every private is interchangeable in theory with everybody else. And then with the likes of Schmidt or Foucault or whatever, as security particular and colonization, as these things began to kind of unfold, and as European military powers in particular, after Westphalia, had some sort of agreement that they wouldn't invade each other, but they would go across the globe, armies got very interested in productivity. I'm very interested in work organizations. So you see the beginnings of continuous flow production and things like that. First off in the UK and other parts of Europe, France, and so on. And then it really takes a kind of boost in the 1800s with the United States and the interchangeable parts and the rise of the American system of manufacture, which had the great advantage of not needing guns to be crafted and repaired as whole guns, but could have interchangeable parts, which was much easier to kind of repair and ship and all the rest of it to parts of the West as America kind of expanded west and south. So I've been interested in that. That takes us back, I guess, to our contemporary situation where the geopolitics that we're witnessing, that we sort of forgot about with globalization and the fantasy of that, is very much on my mind, but it's very much a historic kind of trend.
Take on things. Well, you know something that I guess what's interesting there, or there are lots of interesting things in what you said. One is, of course, the place of engineering, the rise of engineering for military reasons. Everything from the sort of work you're talking about to building bridges.
Yeah.
But the other thing that is really interesting, I think, is that there's been quite a lot of talk about things like a new world order or the collapse of the old world order or whatever. But there's also talk about the fact that, the different armaments being made by different countries actually often don't have very good interoperability. And that this is one of the issues involved in the United States' withdrawal from support of Ukraine, along with the fact that when things are interoperable, sometimes they come with requirements that they only be used with the agreement of the manufacturer.
Yes. I mean, the British nuclear deterrent is that, right? It can only be used if the American government gives consent. But equally, the European predicament at the moment is, do we champion our defense industries, or do we pool and create a kind of European defense industry? How do we move across these kind of quite old territorial nation state, get over those hurdles, and we can see that Europe struggles with that for long historical reasons, and that the American government in its current incantation might actually rule if Europe does overcome these gaps. It'll make the world a more dangerous place again, I suspect. But it will also, lessen European dependence on the United States, with all the consequences, I guess, good and bad of that from both perspectives.
Well, look, people like you and me, Jerry, would say that Prof, would say that Western Europe is the cradle of colonialism and of world war, but for some people it's the cradle of fucking civilization, dude. So,
Well,
get on the team now.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I mean, it's like if you read it, there's a bunch of interesting kind of early 20th century German thinkers, Hinze and Weber himself. Um, who pinpoint the rise of the military as central to the rise of the nation state. Of course, the absolute, both the, in the absolutist state, but then the nation state kind of more the democratic nation
The
state.
legitimate monopoly on violence.
And the legitimate monopoly on violence, but also its embracing of rationalization, to go back to your engineering kind of point.
Yeah. Yeah.
And bureaucracy and so on. It's only with that and the marshalling of all the resources that allows you is kind of central to the nation state. But if you make if the military is fundamentally involved and perhaps even driving your nation state, it's probably not a surprise you end up with colonialism and expansion and these things.
Quite so. But I guess another thing to think about is that if for a moment we pop the UK into Europe for the purposes of these discussions, because it's clear that it is there and it's a leader. I imagine it's Britain and France that are most immediately on a position to move on to a wartime footing, with Germany not far behind, in that there's very little British manufacturing other than the war economy.
Yeah.
And obviously, they and the French are forever selling their weapons of destruction around the world. The other interesting thing that's fascinating me at the moment is as I listen to debates about how long it would take to get out from under the nuclear skirt, as it were, people say umbrella of the United States. People are saying, well, if we actually used all these billions of euros we've stolen from Russia, this could be done really very quickly, like 18 months. And some people are saying a few months even.
Yeah, I mean, just in terms of France has a truly independent nuclear capability.
Yeah.
And it's very Britain when it sold off its nuclear, privatized its nuclear industries, privatized its its energy companies. The EDF, the French company, bought a large slice of them and then closed down their nuclear R&D and the nuclear kind of wings. So Britain is in a slightly different, when it cancelled a Chinese plan to build a nuclear power station, but the French can do it. And I imagine that the Germans have all the intellectual and industrial kind of resources to do it if they so chose, and if they combined with the French. And 200 billion could do a lot of, you could build a lot of arms.
They could also do a lot for healthcare and education and transport and poverty, but hey. So now, if I could take us to Ireland for a moment here. Ireland has a very, very interesting history in terms of obviously resistance to English colonialism and British colonialism and imperialism and occupation, all the rest of it. It also has a very interesting history in terms of the First and Second World Wars. An extremely complicated one. Yeah?
Yeah, very complicated. The First War, Ireland was in the throes of a long campaign for what we would call home rule, which would essentially be that it would run its own affairs, but the British state would deal with war, deal with foreign relations and so on. And of course, that split the population between a kind of unionist segment of the population, making up about 25%, I guess, and a nationalist segment. And these guys formed their own quasi-military wings and all of this sort of stuff just before World War I. And then both sides enlisted in huge numbers, but in separate battalions and so on. And both sides suffered really quite large casualties. The British state didn't implement conscription in Ireland because although they were volunteering, to say they had to join the British Army was probably a bridge too far. And then, of course, with that in the middle of that, in the middle of the war, we get the Easter 1916 Rising, which is a very small affair, and most people are kind of slightly horrified by it. But then the execution of the leaders creates a whole groundswell, which turns into then a war of independence and splits the island at the end of it. And then there's a kind of period of really economic stagnation in the south. The north, what's now called Northern Ireland, had all the industrial, not all, but most of the industrial kind of capacity. The south was a kind of rural based economy. And it stagnates, so that then again, in the Second War, you get people volunteering, some driven by money and economic poverty, but some also driven by, a kind of a moral sense that we should defend. Interestingly, that moral sense, the defense of small nations that Britain went to the First War championing, didn't apply to Ireland. It didn't champion for sort of independence for Ireland, so that moral factor was there for the Second War. But also, I think some of that was just driven by economics, and obviously the population and the Unionist population in the north very much signed up. But Ireland stayed neutral.
And some in the south worried, as I understand it, that the English/British would use the war as a chance to invade and impose martial law on the entire island. And so some felt they had to do a balancing act because they were worried about the Germans invading them as a way of getting to Britain. And they worried about the British invading them as a way of stopping the Germans from doing that. And they had to play a complex game. Would that be fair to say?
It would be fair to say. De Valera, who was what we would call the Taoiseach, or the Prime Minister at the time, played a very delicate diplomatic game. And even at the end of the war, when Hitler's death was announced, he went to sign condolences and so on at the Nazi embassy, for which some of my friends in England who were aware of that always chastise him and myself about, and I can see why. But there was this very important moment, I think, for him and for that political elite to appear to be 100% neutral. And I mean, and Ireland still holds on to that neutrality quite severely. So it's not in NATO. It will send some UN peacekeeping forces, but it won't, for example, it's not contemplating putting any troops on the ground in the Ukraine and so on. So it holds on to that neutrality very, very closely. But it's beginning to realize that that's becoming, as to go back to the geopolitics of today, that's becoming incredibly difficult. And you get US senators on various committees saying, Ireland needs to beef up its military strength because so much of the underwater cabling for the internet and for finance and all of that runs past or through Irish borders. And obviously it's also a route in for a lot of drugs into Europe.
And I guess that raises another interesting point about the military, Prof, namely that a lot of people don't realize that much of the physical infrastructure of the internet, in terms of the cables you're talking about, came from British colonialism/imperialism, rubber from Malaysia, for example. Just as a lot of international telephony historically arose from that it used to be the case that to telephone from Bangladesh to India, you went through London.
Yes.
Why it cost a lot. Well, one reason.
Yeah.
But we don't even have the internet at all without the Cold War and the Pentagon looking to construct a version of the freeway system namely that you would have a decentralized mode of transportation that would allow, on the one hand, quick mobility of US arms and people in the event of war, but on the other hand, meant there wasn't one place and one thing to knock
Yeah.
out.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
And that's why we have the packet system.
Yeah, indeed. And it's, I mean, you can look through, the containerization that radically changed the economy starts with the Americans in Korea, shipping arms. The continuous flow production, the assembly line, crudely, kind of starts in the British military and the naval docks in Portsmouth during actually, Jeremy, I should tell you this. You'll enjoy this, I think. Jeremy Bentham's brother, Samuel, used to command the engineering in the docks. And he, with various kind of technicians and engineers, he built the pulleys for the blocks on the sails were handmade, craft workers. But the Navy needed 100,000 of them at least a year, so they mechanized it. They actually went and studied how these people worked, mechanized it, almost got full-fledged continuous flow production. But the other thing is, Jeremy was a military man, spent time in Ukraine, actually, when the Russians first invaded. Well, not first, but when they invaded in the 1860s. And he was so horrified by serf labor and its lack of productivity. He wasn't horrified in a good way, that he designed the Panoptic. So the Panoptic starts as a work organization rather than Foucault and Samuel Bentham's prison. It actually starts with a military man. I forget the chap's name. The Catherine's great lover, the Russian military aristocrat.
Catherine the Great and her boyfriend. I'll look it up while you keep talking.
Well, he received some of these Ukrainian lands when the colonization or whatever took place. But Jeremy Bentham, his brother Samuel, designs the Panoptic to try and control labor in the Ukraine, and then brings that back to the military docks, to the naval docks in the UK, builds a model of it to show to his brother, and his brother then begins to do his whole disciplinary society stuff.
Was this Alexander Lanskoy?
Oh, it might be him, yes.
Or it could be Grigory Orlov.
Oh, or maybe it's
quite
Orlov.
A list.
Yeah, no, there's quite a list. Yes, there's quite a list.
So anyway, I didn't know any of that.
Yeah, so if you think about it, between mechanization, between the Panoptic starting in a kind of military, basically in military work organizations. If you think about the American Engineering Corps, who designed the structure and organizational structure, and were asked by the American government to roll out and help build canals and railways and so on, because they had better expertise than the private sector companies. But when they did that, they also placed people in those railway companies to help give them an organizational form that Chandler says is their corporate form. And he thinks and he argues very strongly it's a railway form originally. But actually, if you go back one further step, it's the military, it's the US Engineering Corps that's deeply involved with the railway companies that then give us the multi-divisional corporate form that, Chandler says transforms America and turns it into a turns it into an economic giant. So all of these different things, when and that's not to mention, the internet, not to mention robotics, not to mention, aerospace, space kind of travel, all that stuff. If you look at the impact of the military on our social relations is huge. And when you read, say, liberal historians or whatever, this whole notion that somehow, the economy only gets better when we take out the politics, or it's the separation of its liberalism and the sort of small state that gives us this capitalism. Actually, capitalism, it's a war capitalism. Much more, as Alias and Lazzarato kind of, War Capital, their book, point out. And it's deeply embedded in colonialism and Schmidt's kind of geopolitics of, the early 20th century and so on.
Now, Prof, this makes me think, I have been for some minutes, of your book on the dark side of management, which is a very notable volume, much read, much admired, from, I guess, about 10 years ago now. Would that be right?
About right. Yeah, I think I'm always getting it mixed up, whether it's sort of 16 or 17, because, you know what it's like more than me, Toby. You get a book, you get it out of your system, and it's a year or two before it actually appears on a shelf or anything like that. But you were working on it 2 or 3 years before that moment, so the dates get kind of blurred.
Well, because one of the things you work on there is that we need to look at management theory in a sense on its own terms, rather than attacking management from without exclusively, by using Deleuze or Foucault or Marx.
Yeah.
You need to see what these guys were on about, which actually Marx did know, as you also pointed out, because they were actually purposive actors. They were making things happen. And we mightn't like it always, but it had effects. Just like when you read Henry Ford, and the stuff that he wrote or was written for him, one mightn't like it, but it was purposive. Yeah. I wonder if you could take us back a bit to that book, perhaps talk about its main point.
Yeah.
You don't know it, but also say whether you think things have changed, whether the orange comb-over and his man-child at his side evidence anything new.
In one sense, if I was writing that book again or updating that book, maybe, the orange comb-over and his man-child are kind of manna from heaven. Because like those writers, Taylor and Mayo and others back in the early 20th century, they're very clear about what they're trying to do. There's a sort of moment in management where it becomes about efficiency, in the post-war period, and it becomes, about making people better at work or empowering them at work. Yeah. Which is, of course, untrue. It's about more control at work, but it's wrapped up in a kind of liberation. But the people at the founding of management as a set of kind of practices, they were really quite elite theorists, and they taught that the world was there was a hierarchy for very particular reasons. And, the people at the top of it were there because they knew how to run things. And Mayo, for example, who's often seen as the kind of starting of human relations and a kind of the human face of management, was deeply hostile to labor organizations, deeply hostile, went to Africa, went to West Australia and so on to kind of to work with the mining companies, which were incredibly exploitative. Taught of people. Actually, he taught about some of the workers that Taylor had made redundant, who had very good, relatively good labor aristocracy kind of jobs, and then he went and sort of saw them as pathetic because they were, somehow upset, bothered, protesting. Marxists were irrational, but they were very, very explicit that what management was to do, a bit like neoliberals do with the economy. you know, neoliberals think with the state that we're all lazy and we should all be put to work all the time. And the state should regulate the economy in order to do that. Well, these people taught in the organization more or less exactly the same, that we're all lazy, we all need to be put to work, and they're the people who should organize the structures so that that's what happens. And if we don't conform to that, it's because we're irrational. Actually, one of the guys, Maslow's hierarchy of needs, right?
You poor old Abe.
Yeah.
He is a piñata by the time you finish with the bastard.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, we should all self-actualize. And he actually uses an example of a woman changing her son or daughter, her baby's nappies or diapers, if people are in North America or whatever, and that should be something that she does often and self-actualizes through. Rather than, and by implication, if you or I are working in a factory with a similar, I've changed a lot of diapers and nappies, and it's kind of unpleasant, at least once the baby gets past that kind of initial stage where everything smells of kind of milk. There's a sort of, and he also taught that Marxists were irrational, and that, he was very hostile to trade unions. And one of the reasons he pushed this creativity moment is because only some can self-actualize and some therefore should run things. And he had a hierarchy of North American white men, followed by Europeans, and then we know how it probably goes down. And the very early management stuff written in 1910 and so on, it's all very close to eugenics and things like that. So I see management as something that we should take seriously, not as a set simply of practices, but it's kind of elite, elite struggles from above, that they are sort of thinking through the organization, how we organize society, the winners, the losers, who gets to partake in decision making, who doesn't. And of course, again, to go back to the military, it's deeply hierarchical, deeply top-down command, and in that sense, the military in Europe is one of the first. The Dutch military, funny enough, is one of the first militaries to really begin to kind of move away from the individual soldier as brave or somehow dare-doing, and to a monotonized kind of set of machine activities that are commanded from afar by Napoleon or somebody, the Dutch equivalent, even earlier, Nassau, the Duke of Nassau, that were commanded from afar and just moved around like cogs in a machine. And I think management has always done that. And I think that the reason I liked that group of management thinkers that I looked at in the beginning was that they explicitly said it. And then management became a bit more conscious of its PR, and now sells us, that we can liberate ourselves through work.
Well, I'm thinking back 40 odd years when there was this vague competition between the discourse of employee participation and the discourse of industrial democracy.
Yeah.
And the soft left Social Democrats were all for employee participation, not very keen on industrial democracy. Are those terms even used today? I mean, would anybody study that at your school, for example?
No, there's no. Employee participation would get dressed up as human resource management, quality circles and things like that.
I've always loved this idea of people as resources.
Yeah.
There was a nice word I thought called personnel, but
yes,
You're not allowed to call us people anymore. We're resources.
No,
Anyway,
we're resort, and of course that very obviously ties very close to Becker human capital theory and this kind of thing.
right.
So the gap between them and the neoliberal elitism is not very far at all, and that's why and I think Donald Trump and Musk and all the billionaires would very explicitly acknowledge this, I think, which would make them more interesting, perhaps, to study than the people who kind of try and schmooze you.
Yeah, well, this is, I guess, one of the arguments being made that there isn't, well, up to now, perhaps it's different this week, but there isn't really that great a difference in public policy applied to the rest of the world than was the case under the Clintons or Obama or Biden. They all wanted Western Europe, their NATO in inverted commas partners, to pay more. They just said it privately rather than publicly. They were worried about whether or not it was worth the United States being invested so heavily in its military. And you get that back to Eisenhower and his famous departing speech as president, where he coins the term the military-industrial complex.
Yeah.
And so I think that argument's quite interesting. The thing that I'm finding quite contradictory in certain ways is that people rightly say this is the imperial presidency, which for those who are not familiar with the term is a domestic argument. It's not an argument outside the United States. It's about accreting power within the presidential office and away from Congress and the courts. I think there's no doubt that's happening. But the other thing is that it's a very imperialistic presidency as well. And Canada, Panama, Mexico, Greenland, are all feeling this very keenly, as are the people of Gaza. And so I'm interested in how that, in a sense, conflicts with the notion of no more adventurism, no more boots on the ground, to use that awful expression, and isolationism. It's not isolationism at all.
No.
Actually viciously expansionist, at least in its rhetoric. Yeah.
Yes, and also, but also, I guess, obviously Gaza, it's, horrifying. And in one sense, that kind of whole try and remake the Middle East without putting boots on the ground, but by military and economic support of what is, the Israeli kind of defense forces as a, dare I say it, impressive military force. The deal with Ukraine for its rare metals and so on is kind of, in one sense, the Russian military force are a kind of proxy, here in that, you can put pressure on Ukraine to then, give you some sort of deal that looks like maybe a kind of, like a kind of extortion.
But really, there's no difference between that and the traditional Pax Americana or Pax Britannica.
No.
We will protect you from people like us if you give us your oil, rubber, fill in the category.
Yeah. Now, so I wouldn't be surprised if you get, and obviously you get proxy armies, I suspect, in other parts of the world. Also, just with the, like Obama did, all the kind of killing people remotely, all of that can kind of take place. He's certainly scaring Europe.
Oh, hugely. For people outside Europe, I've never experienced such anxiety as is going on today. It's quite extraordinary. It's not, I think, quite such a big thing in Spain, but obviously what we might call the frontline states in Northern Europe, it really is the Swedes, the Norwegians, the Poles, obviously the Baltic states, these, for them to use an expression, this shit is real,
Yeah,
just as it is, despite what the lapdogs of Beijing would have you believe, for the Vietnamese, the Japanese, the
yeah,
Taiwanese, the South Koreans, I mean, you name it in Southeast Asia.
yeah,
You know, they'll do anything to keep the US happy
yeah.
in terms of the threat they perceive from China, right?
And I think that that's, yeah. So the Pax Americana now will, it's a different form, I guess. It's going to leverage that and, scare people. Like we couldn't scare the Europeans into spending any more than 1.5% or whatever on the military. Now they'll all, the Poles are spending 5. The British have just said they're going to go to 2.5.
Right. They're now going to bomb people instead of feeding them. I think it's a direct switch of money from one budgetary category to another.
I mean, what they've done with the international aid budget, and the Americans did the same, right? The first thing they slashed. So in that sense, they're telling, both states are telling the world the gloves are off. We're going to go back to some sort of raw power. Which the British don't have too much of, in comparison.
They've got the King of England.
They do.
Now, Prof, we've got about a quarter of an hour left, and I didn't want to pass through that time without going back to your work on the professions.
Yes.
And also, I wanted to ask you a little bit about critical management studies, so-called.
Yeah.
Now, what I'd like to do, if that's all right, is I'd like you to talk about your earlier work from 25 years ago on the professions, to talk a bit about critical management studies, so-called, and then to leave a little bit of time for anything else we haven't discussed that you'd like to talk about, or anything you'd like to add to what you've already said. Does that sound okay as a way of bringing things to a close?
That sounds great.
First of all, the professions. What are they? I know experts can't be trusted, and we have no trust in them.
Experts cannot be trusted. The German doctors proved that in the war. But as you know, Toby, I'm a sociologist originally. So the professions is a kind of sociology, sociology of the professions is this kind of, I guess, subset of the discipline. I was doing my PhD in Dublin, and I was actually interested, I don't know if I've told you this, Toby, I was actually interested in migration and international development.
I think you had told me that, but I must admit I'd forgotten.
Mm-hmm. Right. And my supervisor, James Wickham, who was excellent supervisor, he had done a lot of work around engineers and this, and basically the new International Division of Labour. And I wanted to do something on that. And he said to me, well, you can't do, Ireland was trying to get international companies and so on in to develop its economy. So were they going in as low skilled or high skilled? And these were kind of, I guess, issues in Ireland at the time. And so he said to me, don't do engineers and don't do, look at accountants because they're part of that financial world. So I began looking at accountants, and then I got more and more interested in them and lawyers, and less interested in the new International Division of Labour. They overlapped because, Saskia Sasan and people like that were writing the global cities books, and there was a kind of there was the emergence, I guess, of financialization and things like that, so that these accountants and lawyers were, at least the powerful ones were becoming located in very specific places and expanding dramatically. And London was one of those places, and so I got involved with accountancy firms to kind of talk about that. And then I sort of realized that the professions, I wasn't interested in the sociology of the professions in the sense of, are doctors just naturally generous people and, not interested in money, but interested in caring for us. I wasn't so interested in that. I was much more interested in, as socioeconomic structures change, professions change. So now we don't call them professions anymore. They're skilled expert labor or skilled or whatever. And the doctors in Britain resisted, for example, the National Health Service, had a very private market kind of way of thinking about themselves, and then were forced into the NHS and are now some of the biggest defenders of, free medicine. The lawyers and accountants, as the Big Bang and all those things happened, jumped right in and helped to expand those things. So I became very interested in professions as a kind of weather vane, if that's the right way of putting it, to how societies and economic structures are changing, because they're educated enough and skilled enough to be able to jump both ways in a way that miners don't. Miners kind of have to resist. The accountants just changed what they do. They shifted from auditing to management consultancy and to building international, with the lawyers, building new international regulatory regimes for finance to move. So they became a kind of part of that transnational capitalist class, to use Leslie Sklair's term. But so I got very interested in how our ideas of professionalism shift over time, and what that shift, rather than seeing it as just a sort of ideology, to trace it back to root into kind of economic practices.
I'm thinking back to when I worked as a bureaucrat in Australia in the early 80s, and there was a very formalized state-endorsed trades recognition procedure, whereby you had to get endorsed by the government inter alia if you were a shoemaker or a smithy or any of these sorts of tasks. And the labor movement said, why don't we do that with accountants, for example? But the Council on Professional Qualifications, which was, of course, self-legislating, would have none of this. And I think it probably works in professions that have high protective walls based on government, like medicine. Where they did need state participation, but in other areas, not so much. And I guess that's also, in Weberian terms, an old notion of the profession as one that, old thing, just leave it up to us. We know what a real X or Y is.
And of course that, it's not what I discovered, I guess, if that's the right term, is that they were also these big law firms and big accountancy firms and so on. They were the very first movers, or some of the very first movers, into the idea of the worker as an entrepreneur, the enterprising worker. So you have to generate your own income and more, which has been a long tradition in those fields. But when they were small, family run, father and son kind of, lawyers, that was one thing. But as they became really multinational corporations, they began to drive this idea of labor as enterprising, as the entrepreneurial economy. And of course, they built big management consultancy wings and all the rest of it, where they sort of began to then proselytize these kind of ways of thinking about organizing. So in that sense, they're an interesting, group of people to study. And they for all the rhetoric of the knowledge economy, the enterprising economy, all of that stuff, they're very much at the center of that, both as an object of study, but also they themselves kind of proselytizing for it.
And this leads me on to something in a way related, which is the critical management studies domain, but also as an adjunct to that, what I think of as path-breaking students, but what are sometimes called students from non-traditional backgrounds.
Yes.
And you have been path-breaking in your desire to alter pedagogy and alter institutions so that they are more appealing and better able to engage those people. So I wondered if you could, maybe they're separate, maybe they're connected. Adumbrate for us a little bit of what this critical tendency is and how it might relate to the idea that perhaps these fancy business schools that get people jobs and money might themselves be altered, and what that means for path-breaking students.
Well, the critical management studies itself, it sort of splits into a number of, I guess, streams, some of which I find a little irritating, because they'll go and, they'll read Deleuze or they'll read Foucault or whatever. It's not that these scholars don't have things to teach us. Obviously they do. But it becomes more of a, rather than looking at what Frederick Taylor advocated for work, I'm going to tell you what Deleuze said and how it might be applied, in some little bit of management. And, I'm not suggesting we don't do that, but it sort of became a bit of a fad, I guess. And that's, that has its uses, but I think there's a second strand where people sort of think, well, actually, let's treat management seriously as a thing to study in its own right, as a set of practices to study in their own right, because they actually do have very direct impacts on people's working lives. And let's teach that as well, so that, again, it ties into teaching. The students that come to me, they don't really want to hear about, Foucault or Deleuze. They think they're coming to learn about marketing. And that's fine. But then if you teach them, well, look, capitalism is about selling stuff, a bunch of other things. But, your job is to encourage consumption. And one of the environmental impacts of that, let us think through that kind of stuff. So there's pedagogically not to treat management as a set of technical practices, but to teach it as a political set of political activities. And then the students can decide for themselves, well, I think that is a perfectly valid thing to do, or I never thought of it like that. That's making me rethink some stuff. And then there's another layer to this, which is close to my heart. I don't come from a family of incredibly well-educated people or anything like that. So I went to university kind of with slight trepidation. And I think my experience of teaching in the UK has been that an awful lot of the business students that come to me are sons and daughters of immigrants, people who are smart and have worked hard, but are slightly alienated by the university and afraid of it. People who've invested a lot and families who've invested a lot, so therefore don't want to, are probably a little risk averse, even though they're going to do business, which is supposed to be about taking risks. So then you've got to think about what you do with them in the room, and how do you take, like Freire maybe in his pedagogy, how you take the things that they arrive in the room with, which will be interesting. They'll be marginalized. They won't be white often. Their parents will be immigrants. They may well, where I am at the moment, they will often be Islamic. So they understand the world doesn't give you a fair crack at a whip. And they also understand, and then when you begin to kind of work through how management doesn't give you a fair crack at a whip, they are often open to it, they often get it, and they often find it quite rewarding. And that's meant I've given up, for example, the lecture seminar format. I don't do that anymore. This year I had them for 3 hours in a room where I would record all the lectures. We would read some stuff. They would be in groups. They would do some group presentations. And then afterwards, in the second kind of half of that session, I would put Milton Friedman or somebody up on the, give them a copy of that, ask him to think through some questions about what he's saying, who's winning, who's losing, how does what Milton Friedman says this week relate to what Rebecca Henderson, who's kind of an anti-Friedmanite organizational thinker, said last week, and get him to read and kind of answer these questions. And I got the university to buy them notebooks where they would physically write, which is, many of them haven't been writing essays, haven't been physically taking notes. So you've got to kind of teach them that practice, and teach them that when they do that, they own the knowledge. They have to turn somebody's words into theirs. It sticks. They own it. They understand it. Stuff that you and I would have probably learned, Toby, in school. They're, because of the deprivation of their education system, they don't do A levels, for example. For those people in non-British parts of the world, the A level is what we would traditionally think of as a good school education, where you would read English literature or whatever. They do a BTEC in business, where they would have 12 modules over 2 years. One would be retail management. What does a shopping mall look like? Why do you have a big store in a shopping mall? What's the advantage or disadvantage of that? So when they get to university, they really have a lot there's an awful lot to learn to give them what I would call critical and analytical skills. Because if you don't, they'll get a better job than they would have had, but it will be the assistant manager of the local supermarket. Mm-hmm. It won't be what we've sold them, which is they've got Canary Wharf, the big financial center down. If they go left, that's where that is. And if they go right, we've got the old city of London where the other big financial center is. And we kid them that they're going to get in there, but they won't without these skills. So I guess, and there's a core in critical management, to answer your question, that I think is really about that critical pedagogy, and trying to, but it's getting harder. I don't know, Toby, how familiar you are with the British system these days, but it's getting much, much harder to do that kind of thinking anymore, both because of the scale of the number of students, but also modularization and everything else. The whole trend of university in the last, at least in business schools, in the last 20 years has been against that. It's been, multiple choice questions, have a textbook. There are 12 weeks in the semester. There's 12 chapters in the textbook. We'll do one and that's it, So I don't know if that answers your question.
It does wonderfully. And you managed to put together the double-barreled query I had that didn't really make sense to me even as I formed it. So, Prof, to finish up, are there things we've discussed that you want to revisit? Are there things we haven't touched on that you'd like to mention?
I guess the thing that I've moved maybe more towards is the poverty. I just finished a project where I spent time in the schools. So before people come to university, one of the reasons I was able to talk about BTECs and A levels and so on was I spent time in the schools looking at. I gave some lectures. I talked to students. I talked to teachers. I sat in on classes and so on. And it's quite stunning to me how destructive Britain has been with its education system. I'm not sure how I'm not sure if it was ever better, learning to labor and all of that stuff. But I compare what the education my son gets, which is that traditional A level, I guess, a grammar school type education, and what the bulk of students get, and it's really quite horrifying to me that with all the Labour governments and all the Britain hasn't changed. It's still before you hit 15, it's done to some sad extent. I mean, obviously not for everybody, but for a lot of people, it's
big time.
Britain is a tough place to be these days, and it doesn't feel. I guess it doesn't feel very hopeful, and that's a bit of a sad note to end on. But a
lot of the things we've been discussing are very negative, but they also have, I guess it's Robert Merton, right? Unintended consequences.
Yeah.
In many cases.
Yeah.
And some of the worst things that have been done in the world in the name of horror, like huge Pentagon budgets, have produced some positive things. I mean, all sorts of media technologies derive from the war, not just the internet, but Ariflex cameras.
Yeah.
There's no possibility of a cinema verite or direct cinema radical movement without the Second World War.
Yeah.
Stimulating new ways of recording things.
Yeah.
All kinds of aspects that we can look at positively. But I think you've offered a very timely reminder, as the cliche goes, of a lot of the things that we need to be alert to, and given at least me new ways of thinking about them. So
yeah. I mean, I just on that, I've just finished my teaching, and as I was saying, we kind of reworked it. But I really enjoyed it, and I still insist on doing the first semester kind of course, because they arrive, they don't know what a university is. You can actually work quite a lot with them, and they're still amazingly fun.
Well, and that's a very positive story, and I think it also has a very important lesson, which is always be prepared to teach freshman students. Always be prepared to teach undergrads. Don't just focus on the scholarly elite.
Yeah.
And there you'll find some gold.
Yes. Yeah.
And maybe they will too, in one another.
Yes. And we've got to be more thoughtful. Like one of the things I've realized is, I come out of it's a different system in Ireland, but it's more or less that A-level education. So I was always thinking this was what was the raw material in front of me, if you like, right? Mm-hmm. But of course, they're very, very different. The world has changed enormously. The education system, so it's actually been very good for me to go back and have a look and see. And it changed. Yeah, it completely sort of made me rethink my teaching, which I gotta maybe sit and write up and think about. Oh, one other thing is I'm hoping to write a book on this military stuff, which pulls in all sorts of, I'm thinking through all sorts of stuff around Foucault's security and his disciplinary kind of society, but equally Engels on the collective state as the collective capitalist and a whole bunch of other things. So that's the other and I'm on a sabbatical with a bit of luck, please God, in 26.
Wonderful. Well, I hope it won't be that long before we actually manage to share a jar together.
That would be lovely.
Whatever kind. It's always lovely to see you, and yeah. I've really appreciated the time you've shared with us today.
Oh, listen, it's been great to see you, and I hope to see you. Yeah, I hope to see you soon over a football game.
Now we're talking.